On the morning of December 17th, 1944, at 6 a.m., at the Malmedy crossroads in Belgium, the temperature dropped to -8 degrees Celsius. Second Lieutenant Werner Potsky heard a sound that felt entirely out of place on the European battlefield, a sharp mechanical whine, reminiscent of an aircraft engine, yet clearly originating from the ground. In the snow-filled darkness before dawn, his veteran Waffen-SS reconnaissance squad advanced cautiously. This 11-man team hailed from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, battle-hardened from hundreds of engagements across the Russian and French fronts. Intelligence indicated that this crossroads was guarded only by logistical supply units, rear echelon soldiers without heavy weaponry. To these SS veterans, they seemed like easy prey. Potsky had no way of knowing in the darkness that an olive-drab GMC CCKW 6x6 truck lay in wait. The truck appeared ordinary, but a single modification had completely rewritten the rules of mobile warfare. Mounted on its flatbed was a 3-inch 50 caliber naval anti-aircraft gun. This weapon, once used to guard U.S. destroyers and repel Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, was now perched on a truck chassis in the Ardennes forest. It boasted a firing rate of up to 15 rounds per minute, with each high-explosive shell weighing 50 pounds. The 5-man crew operating the gun were from the U.S. Navy Armed Guard, on what the Navy called a temporary deployment, attached to an Army logistics unit for the mission. At 6:15 a.m., the truck commander, First Sergeant James Michael Donnelly from Boston, Massachusetts, spotted movement through his binoculars. Approximately 400 yards away, German infantry were advancing in tactical formation. He turned to his crew with a grim yet slightly amused expression. "Boys, we have a surface target. Load high explosives. Fire on my command." What happened in the next 4 minutes gave birth to a legend that spread through the German ranks faster than official intelligence. The Devil Truck had arrived on the Western Front. The Germans were about to witness the power of American industrial improvisation, turning a mere supply truck into a devastating instrument of slaughter. The idea of mounting heavy weapons on trucks was not new. Armies had experimented with self-propelled artillery since World War I. However, the American approach was revolutionary due to its sheer scale, audacity, and the flexibility to mount various weapons onto standard commercial truck chassis. The story began in early 1943 when the U.S. Navy faced a dilemma. Thousands of 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns mass-produced for escort destroyers, and cruisers were outstripping the pace of ship construction. Warehouses were filled with idle guns lacking platforms. Meanwhile, the Army, advancing through North Africa and Italy, desperately needed mobile anti-aircraft fire to cover its marching columns. Accounts vary on who first proposed the simple idea of putting naval guns on trucks, but the core logic was clear. The Army's main GMC CCKW 6x6 cargo truck could handle the weight. The Navy had trained gunners, and the Army lacked mobile firepower. Why not combine them? This initial stopgap solution eventually evolved into a large-scale project, resulting in the deployment of over 2,000 armed trucks of various configurations. The M51 multiple-gun motor carriage equipped with 4.5 zero-caliber heavy machine guns, the M16 variant with 4 identical machine guns in an electric turret, and the M15, which integrated a 37mm autocannon with 2.5 zero-caliber machine guns. Non-standard modifications were even more diverse, featuring everything from 3-inch 50 caliber guns to 5-inch 38 caliber naval guns. In the summer of 1943, German intelligence first encountered these vehicles in Italy. Their assessment report was dismissive. The Americans are mounting anti-aircraft guns on trucks, an improvisation that proves their inability to mass-produce proper self-propelled anti-aircraft platforms. These vehicles lack armor, standard fire control, and tactical mobility. Determination, minimal threat to armored units. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong, yet it reflected a deep-seated German misunderstanding of American military culture. They viewed improvisation as a sign of desperation, believing that legitimate military vehicles required years of R&D and specialized manufacturing. To them, welding a destroyer's anti-aircraft gun to a truck and sending it to the front seemed amateurish. Ironically, Germany was a pioneer in self-propelled anti-aircraft weaponry, with its Wirbelwind and Ostwind flak tank series, built on tank chassis with sophisticated fire control systems. However, German production could never keep pace with demand. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe and the Army had a combined total of about 3,000 self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles. Meanwhile, the U.S., through its truck arming program alone, possessed over 2,000 mobile platforms and could modify existing trucks and weapons on demand. It was another showdown between German precision and American mass production, and mass production had already won. Sergeant Donnelly joined the service in 1942 and trained as a gunner at the Great Lakes Naval Station. Expecting to fight Japanese planes in the Pacific, he was instead sent to the Atlantic for armed guard duty on merchant ships. In March 1944, his ship was torpedoed near Iceland, and the survivors were folded into the Armed Truck Project. No one explained why Navy gunners were being attached to the Army, and no one clarified the chain of command or tactical doctrine. The 5-man team was issued a GMC truck with a 3-inch naval gun, 20 rounds of ammunition, and orders to report to the 1st Army Logistics Command in England. Their training was cursory at best. 3 days of truck driving, 1 day of Army radio operation, and a brief lecture on not shooting down friendly planes. The Navy assumed they knew gunnery. The Army assumed the Navy knew operational requirements. Everyone felt they could just make it work. Initially, Donnelly was resistant. The Navy was about procedures and regulations, and this haphazardness unsettled him. But his loader, 2nd-class Petty Officer Robert Chen from San Francisco, saw it clearly. While maintaining the gun at a supply depot in France, he said, "Sir, we have the best flak gun in the fleet. 15 rounds a minute, 50 pounds each. We can take down anything except a heavy bomber. If there's a target, we just shoot." The opportunity for combat came sooner than expected. On December 16th, the German Ardennes counteroffensive broke the U.S. lines. Donnelly's truck, originally assigned to a supply company for transport, was suddenly in the combat zone. Before dawn on December 17th, Potsky's SS squad approached the Malmedy crossroads, expecting to find fleeing logistics troops, only to run into Navy gunners trained to hit targets moving at 300 miles per hour. Hitting infantry 400 yards away was child's play. Donnelly's first command was a textbook Navy gunnery call. Target bearing 270, range 400 yards, high explosive, for effect. The 3-inch 50 caliber gun roared, its muzzle flash illuminating the snow like a strobe light. The 50-pound shells, designed for aircraft, landed in the German charge with unimaginable power. The blast radius was immense, far exceeding the killing zone of any infantry weapon. The shockwave radius surpassed 30 yards. Germans within 50 feet of the impact were killed or severely wounded, and even those outside the fragmentation zone were incapacitated by the pressure wave. A single shell devastated an entire German squad. Chen manually traversed the mount, the naval carriage operating smoothly and precisely. Second round, third round. The crew worked in a seamless flow, loading, firing, and traversing in a single rhythmic motion. While their training standard was 15 rounds per minute, in the heat of combat and fueled by adrenaline, their rate of fire far exceeded that. Potsky's squad disintegrated instantly. These veterans, who had survived Kursk and Normandy, had never seen such firepower on a ground battlefield. This was the power of a naval bombardment, not an army weapon. The psychological shock was swift and brutal. This wasn't a tank or a standard field gun you could counter. It was a seemingly fragile truck pouring out world-shattering firepower that defied their tactical understanding. Of the 11-man squad, only 4 managed to escape. When they reported to their company commander, describing an encounter with trucks carrying naval guns with firepower comparable to light artillery, they were initially dismissed as being prone to exaggeration due to panic. However, within hours, similar reports flooded the SS command system. U.S. forces had mounted heavy mobile weapons on truck chassis, with multiple sightings across the breakthrough zones. On December 18th, German intelligence confirmed the threat was real. It was not a series of isolated modifications, but a systematic program. These vehicles were fast and highly mobile, capable of rapid deployment and withdrawal. Their weapons ranged from quad .50 caliber machine guns to suspected 5-inch naval guns, with counts in the dozens or even hundreds. The Germans quickly issued tactical guidance: counter with anti-tank weapons, avoid infantry charges, and suppress with artillery. But the German forces in the Ardennes were already overextended, short on fuel and lacking air support. Their primary objective was to cross the Meuse River before U.S. reinforcements arrived. They had no spare strength to hunt down armed trucks. Conversely, the armed trucks thrived in the chaotic and fluid battlefield of the Battle of the Bulge. With a road speed of 45 miles per hour, they could quickly reinforce threatened areas, and their firepower eclipsed most German mobile anti-aircraft platforms. Whether operated by Navy gunners or Army flak crews, the operators were trained to track high-speed targets, making ground targets easy to engage. Sergeant Michael Kowalski commanded an M16 multiple-gun motor carriage belonging to the 7,143rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. His truck, equipped with 4.50 caliber machine guns in an electric turret, could rotate 360 degrees and had a combined fire rate of over 2,000 rounds per minute. On December 20th, near Bastogne, his truck was attached to a tank destroyer battalion to guard an artillery position. When German infantry attempted to infiltrate through a dark forest path, Kowalski ordered fire at 800 yards. The scene was apocalyptic. Each 50 caliber machine gun fired 450 to 550 rounds per minute. Four firing together produced over 2,000 rounds, creating a wall of lead that no infantry could breach. Even the trees became accomplices. The heavy rounds shattered branches, creating flying wooden splinters that intensified the lethality. Germans hiding behind trees found that the trunks offered no protection. The heavy fire sheared through the wood, destroying the soldiers behind it. Kowalski's after-action report was clinical. Engaged infantry at 800 yards expended 1,200 rounds, repelled enemy advance. Estimated enemy casualties 40 to 50. No friendly losses. But the report failed to capture the psychological terror. Survivors described facing wheeled flying fortresses, bringing the kind of firepower usually reserved for American bombers down to the ground. There seemed to be no limit to what weapons the Americans could mount on their trucks. The standard M15 integrated a 37mm flak gun and 2.50 caliber machine guns. The 37mm had a rate of 120 rounds per minute with 2-pound shells. The M16's quad machine guns were mounted in a Maxon electric turret with smooth traverse and elevation. The M51 carried 240mm Bofors autocannons, the same weapons used by Allied ships to fend off kamikaze attacks. Non-standard naval gun trucks ranged from 3-inch 50 caliber and 4-inch 50 caliber guns to documented cases of the 5-inch 38 caliber naval gun. The GMC CCKW truck carrying these weapons was itself an icon of the American production miracle. Its 6x6 drive system allowed it to traverse mud, snow, and rugged terrain. With a 5-ton capacity, it could climb 60-degree slopes and wade through 30 inches of water. Over 500,000 were produced between 1941 and 1945. The modification process was simple and efficient. Welders removed the cargo bed, welded a gun mount, and installed the weapon. The vehicle's electrical system powered the turrets and fire control, and the chassis could handle the weight without major structural changes. Depot-level facilities could complete a modification in less than a week. Crewmen highly valued the truck's reliability. Its 270 cubic inch inline-6 engine produced only 104 horsepower, but was nearly indestructible. It was easy to maintain with plenty of spare parts, often running for months with minimal service, a critical factor for rapidly advancing operations. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their flak half-tracks were specialized military vehicles that were expensive and complex. For instance, the SDKFZ 7/1 with a 37mm flak gun was superior in performance, but cost 10 times as much as an American armed truck, and production numbers were vastly different. Germany built about 15,000 flak half-tracks throughout the war, while the U.S. had over 2,000 dedicated armed trucks, plus hundreds of thousands of standard trucks that could be modified as needed. On December 23rd, the weather cleared, and the Luftwaffe attempted to support ground forces. The armed trucks finally fulfilled their original anti-aircraft purpose. Deployed at key locations like Bastogne, M15 and M16 units wove a defensive web so dense that German pilots called it impenetrable. Second Lieutenant Hans Müller, flying a Focke-Wulf 190 on a ground attack mission, encountered this fire near St. Vith. After crash landing his severely damaged plane, he reported, "Attacked U.S. supply column, instantly intercepted by dense anti-aircraft fire from multiple points. Tracers formed a wall, plane hit several times, forced to abandon attack." Conclusion: U.S. mobile anti-aircraft density far exceeds previous encounters. Data supported Müller's assessment. In a single day, December 23rd, various armed trucks shot down 42 German aircraft, with a success rate far higher than any previous anti-aircraft weapon. Radar-directed fire control, proximity fuses, and saturated fire formed a lethal combination. Yet the most profound impact of the armed trucks was in ground combat. The German offensive relied on infantry advancing under armored cover. Panzer divisions were the spearhead, while infantry held the captured ground. But even elite SS infantry could not withstand the sustained bombardment of quad machine guns or 3-inch naval guns. Karl Weber, a company commander in the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, led an attempt to break through the American lines at Elsenborn Ridge. His post-capture report spoke to the psychological weight of the armed trucks. On December 19th, launched attack at dawn. Initial advance met little resistance. Then American trucks appeared. Not the supply vehicles we expected, but mobile weapon platforms firing continuously. The roar was deafening, like being in a blast furnace. Soldiers sought cover everywhere, but the fire was too intense. Trees were shredded, and the ground was a constant series of explosions. Comrades were falling, screaming, or simply disappearing in the blasts. Forced to retreat after 30 minutes with 40% casualties, never getting within 200 meters of the American lines. Weber's company entered the battle with 160 men and suffered 94 casualties. This attacking force had no tanks or artillery support, hoping to exploit a gap in the U.S. line, only to be brutally rebuffed by mobile firepower guarding that gap, which was, in reality, a killing zone intentionally left open by the Americans. The tactics of the armed truck crews were forged in combat rather than manuals. No one had written a guidebook for naval guns on land. Navy gunnery was designed for aircraft and ships, while Army anti-aircraft doctrine assumed static defense. The crews had to learn on the fly. Donnelly's team developed a shoot-and-scoot tactic similar to tank destroyer methods. Hide the truck in a position with good lines of fire. Fire 3 to 5 rounds rapidly upon spotting a target, and then immediately relocate to deny German artillery a chance to return fire. With their high mobility, the trucks could move half a mile in 5 minutes. By the time German artillery observers spotted the target and called in fire, the truck was long gone. The Germans knew they needed aircraft or direct fire weapons to track them, but in the desperate situation of December, they were spread too thin. The value of the psychological warfare was equally significant. The Germans gave these trucks 2 nicknames, Devil Trucks and Ghost Trucks. Both captured their lethality and the fear of their here one moment, gone the next nature, appearing without warning, pouring out destruction, and vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. Private John Fesser, captured on December 27th, admitted during interrogation, "We feared the Devil Trucks more than the tanks. You can hear a tank coming, and it has to stay on the road. The Devil Truck appears out of nowhere with the firepower of a battleship and vanishes like a ghost. Officers told us to ignore them and focus on the mission. But how can you ignore something that can wipe out an entire platoon in seconds?" This fear spread rapidly. Veterans spoke to new recruits about the Devil Trucks with a reverence bordering on superstition. Some units refused to advance without a guarantee that there were no armed trucks in the area, a guarantee officers simply could not provide. The technical specifications of these weapons explained their lethality. The 3-inch 50 caliber naval gun fired 50-pound shells with a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second and a rate of up to 15 rounds per minute. Its effective anti-aircraft range was 6 miles, and its ground range was approximately 5 miles, though combat engagements were much closer. Each shell contained 4 pounds of explosive D, with a fragmentation radius exceeding 30 yards. Direct hits pulverized vehicles or fortifications, and near misses could still disable light vehicles and kill exposed infantry. Firing armor-piercing rounds, it could penetrate 3 inches of steel at 1,000 yards, enough to destroy any German half-track or light tank. The M16's quad 50 caliber machine guns carried 2,000 rounds, 500 per gun. Each round weighed about 1.6 ounces with a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. At close range, it could penetrate light armor and had a terrifying effect on infantry. The unique sound of 4 guns firing in unison was unmistakable on the battlefield. Visible even in daylight, the tracers wove together into a stream of fire that the Germans called the water hose of death. Once targeted, there was no escape. The M15 variant, with its 37mm gun and twin .50 caliber machine guns, offered versatility. The autocannon dealt with light vehicles and fortifications, while the machine guns suppressed infantry. Together, they could handle almost any ground threat short of heavy armor. By December 1944, over 1,500 armed trucks of various types were deployed in the European theater, including approximately 600 M16, 400 M15, 300 M51, and about 200 non-standard naval gun trucks. Figures vary by source. These vehicles were scattered among various Army units, assigned to anti-aircraft battalions, tank destroyer battalions, or directly under divisional artillery. The lack of a unified command structure made it difficult for German intelligence to track their movements. They went wherever they were needed, serving as mobile assets for commanders to deploy as necessary, rather than fixed units bound by doctrine. Maintenance was also unexpectedly simple. The GMC chassis used standard parts common throughout the military. Both naval and Army weapons had established maintenance procedures and spare parts supplies. Most repairs could be handled at the maintenance company level, with major overhauls sent to rear area depots. While crew training was varied, Navy gunners like Donnelly were proficient with the guns but lacked ground combat experience, while Army flat crews knew land warfare, but were unfamiliar with some weapons. Everyone adapted quickly, translating existing skills into mobile ground combat capability. The improvised nature of the project was evident in the details. Some trucks had steel plates welded on for armored cabs to protect the driver and co-driver, while others were completely unshielded. Some were fitted with communication equipment to integrate into fire control networks, while others relied solely on visual signals and simple radios. Every vehicle carried the specific ingenuity of its unit. This non-standardization, which would have been a fatal flaw in the German eyes of uniform regulation, became a strength in the American military. Crews could modify vehicles as needed, and good ideas spread quickly through informal channels, while ineffective ones were discarded without waiting for official doctrine. It was evolution in the heat of battle. By January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge drew to a close, German commanders were desperately requesting guidance on how to counter the armed trucks. The responses reflected the dire straits of the German army. Avoid if possible, suppress with artillery, destroy with armor. But all these tactics required resources the Germans had already exhausted. As the American counteroffensive pushed into Germany, the armed trucks transformed into offensive tools. Their speed allowed them to keep up with advancing armored units, and their firepower could suppress German counterattacks. Their versatility allowed them to simultaneously handle aircraft, infantry, and light vehicles. In March 1945, during the crossing of the Rhine, armed trucks provided critical anti-aircraft cover for bridge-building operations. Though severely weakened, the Luftwaffe made a final, desperate attempt to attack the bridges. Armed trucks deployed on both banks wove a defensive net that cost the Germans dearly. Of the 63 German aircraft that attacked the Remagen Bridge, 41 were shot down, 28 of which were credited to armed trucks. Their ground support missions also continued to expand. In the final stages of the drive into Germany, armed trucks often led the way, using their heavy firepower to clear roadblocks and suppress resistance. German forces attempting to hold towns found themselves under the kind of fire that belonged in a naval engagement. The collapse of their psychological defenses accelerated surrenders. Heinrich Müller, a regimental commander of the Volksgrenadier holding a town in the Ruhr pocket, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The Americans would halt outside of range, and then the devil trucks would advance, firing continuously. The noise alone was breaking men. Destruction was everywhere. Houses collapsed. Defensive positions were leveled. Soldiers who had held off tanks for days were broken and fled from these trucks. It was humiliating. We were veterans, trained soldiers, but we couldn't stand against that volume of fire." The production miracle of the armed truck project deserves special emphasis. The vehicles were mass-produced GMC trucks. 635,000 were built during the war. The weapons were already being produced in mass for ships and anti-aircraft use, never intended for land combat. The innovation lay simply in combining them in a new way. This was the essence of the American Industrial War. Germany focused on developing specialized, superior weapon systems that were expensive and slow to produce. The U.S. revitalized existing equipment and combined them creatively to rapidly deploy a massive volume of effective weapons, not always sophisticated, but immensely powerful. The laborers who built these vehicles and weapons reflected the diversity of America. At General Motors' Pontiac plant, women made up over 40% of the workforce. By 1944, African American workers, Mexican American welders, and laborers of all ethnicities were heart and soul in producing components, utterly debunking the German propaganda that only Aryan craftsmen could build fine weapons. Combat performance was the ultimate proof. The success of the armed trucks profoundly influenced post-war military philosophy. Mounting heavy weapons on truck chassis became a standard practice. From the Tau-equipped HMMMWV to anti-aircraft missile trucks, modern military tactical vehicles find their roots in the armed trucks of World War II. The principle of mobility plus firepower equals combat effectiveness remains the core of military doctrine today. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of armed trucks were deployed across Europe. Most were sent back to depots, stripped of their weapons, and converted back to standard cargo trucks. The weapons were returned to Navy or Army arsenals. The crews were either assigned to occupation duties or sent home. Donnelly and his Navy gunners returned to the sea, assigned to an escort destroyer in the Pacific. Using the same 3-inch 50 caliber guns he had used on his truck in Belgium, he participated in the final bombardments of Japan. After the war, Donnelly stayed in the Navy, retiring in 1962 as a senior chief petty officer. He kept only one souvenir, the brass shell casing from the first shot fired at Malmedy, engraved with the date and location. Kowalski returned to Michigan and entered the automotive industry, rarely speaking of his wartime experiences. When asked what he remembered most during an oral history project in 1997, he replied, "It was the sound of 4.50 caliber machine guns firing at once. You never forget that. And the power. They could stop anything except a heavy tank. The Germans were afraid of us, and they were right to be. The memories of German veterans were markedly different. The psychological impact of the devil trucks lasted long after the war. In memoirs and interviews, they spoke of these trucks with a mix of awe and lingering dread. They encapsulated the frustration of fighting the Americans, overwhelming fire, tactical flexibility, and nearly limitless production capacity." Commander Müller, who published his memoirs in 1973, wrote, "The devil truck was the symbol of the American way of war. They didn't defeat us with better soldiers or superior tactics, but by drowning us in firepower, we couldn't match. Behind every American soldier, there seemed to be artillery, aircraft, or these mobile heavy weapons. We fought bravely, but bravery without resources is only a delay of failure." The technological legacy also transcended the military sphere. The concept of rapidly converting commercial vehicles for military use influenced post-war vehicle design. The durability of the GMC truck became a benchmark, and modern military trucks still use the 6x6 configuration pioneered in World War II. The philosophy of modular weapons on standard chassis remains a core design tenet for military vehicles today. Production statistics provide the final verdict. The U.S. built 635,000 GMC CCKW trucks during the war, over 2,000 of which were modified as heavy weapon platforms. These vehicles were credited with shooting down approximately 800 aircraft, destroying over 3,000 German vehicles, and inflicting about 30,000 casualties. A single modification cost about $3,000 in 1944, less than 1% of the cost of a specialized self-propelled anti-aircraft tank. The cost effectiveness was staggering. For the cost of one German flak tank, the U.S. could build 30 armed trucks. In the time it took to develop and produce one specialized weapon system, the U.S. could modify hundreds of existing trucks. The logic of mass-producing enough good enough equipment defined the industrial war and ultimately ensured victory. U.S. forces in Afghanistan and Iraq continued to mount heavy weapons on HM-MMWVs and trucks, creating modern armed vehicles that are direct descendants of the World War II Devil trucks. The core principle has never changed. Mobility plus firepower equals combat effectiveness. Improvising with existing vehicles remains just as effective as specialized weapon systems. The story of the Devil truck is the ultimate illustration of American industrial improvisation and creativity. The Navy had idle flak guns, the Army lacked mobile firepower, and someone simply put the two together. There were no long development cycles or years of testing, just a pragmatic solution to a problem, resulting in a fast and effective weapon. This logic was incomprehensible to the Germans, who emphasized meticulous planning and specialized gear. They used rigorous engineering to build flak tanks, while the Americans welded guns to trucks and sent them to the front. The results speak for themselves. By the end of the war, the number of U.S. armed trucks far exceeded the total of all German mobile anti-aircraft systems. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The German fear of the Devil truck far outweighed the actual casualties it inflicted. Its lethality was undeniable, but its psychological threat was even greater, representing unpredictability and overwhelming firepower appearing without warning. It symbolized the American industrial capacity to deliver weaponry to the battlefield in unexpected forms. This psychological edge, layered over material superiority, further crushed the morale of German troops already reeling from retreats, supply shortages, and Allied air superiority. Facing a ground weapon that combined the power of aircraft, artillery, and naval guns, their unit cohesion and combat will eventually collapse. Today, the surviving armed trucks are museum pieces or held by private collectors. The Museum of the American GI in Texas displays a restored M16, and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans houses an M15. These trucks, once called Devils by the Germans, now stand silently, bearing witness to American ingenuity and industrial might. Almost all the original crewmen have passed away. Donnelly died in 2003, and Kowalski in 2008. Their obituaries mentioned their military service, but rarely detailed the legend of the armed trucks. The story of Navy gunners mounting naval guns on trucks to hunt Germans in the Belgian forests has gradually become a footnote in official history books. However, the legacy is deeply embedded in modern military practice. Every tactical vehicle carrying heavy weapons, every emergency military conversion of a commercial vehicle, and every decision to integrate existing equipment rather than start from scratch is a continuation of the Devil truck philosophy. The German commanders initially mocked the American practice as a desperate improvisation of an army unable to build proper weapons, only to learn a bitter lesson in the Ardennes and on their own soil. An American improvisation backed by industrial power was far more lethal than a masterpiece of German precision that couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers. The Devil truck proved that victory in war is not determined by the most exquisite weapon, but by the overwhelming deployment of sufficient, effective weapons, operated by trained crews and supported by an uninterrupted supply chain. A GMC truck with a naval gun wasn't elegant, wasn't designed by committee, and wasn't the result of years of R&D. It did only one thing. It worked. And the Germans, having suffered across the European battlefield, finally understood. In war, effectiveness is far more important than elegance. The side that can mass produce adequate weapons, adapt flexibly to battlefield needs, and maintain a constant supply will ultimately defeat an opponent with superior weapons, but insufficient numbers. The Germans gave them the name Devil Trucks, a name that held fear, respect, and a late realization. The logic of the American Industrial War was something the German military tradition could not withstand. Mass production, creative improvisation, and overwhelming material superiority. These three combined were invincible. The armed trucks rolled across Europe, rewriting tactical doctrine simply by existing. Trucks could carry naval guns, sailors could fight on land, and improvisations could be more lethal than specialized weapons. These lessons continue to influence modern warfare far beyond public perception. The Devil Trucks have long since vanished, melted down for scrap or resting in museums, but their spirit lives on in every tactical vehicle, every emergency modification project, and every choice to rapidly deploy good enough weapons rather than wait for the perfect one. A naval gun on a truck captured the essence of the American way of war. Creativity plus industrial power can defeat the perfection of scarcity. And the Germans who experienced it, who felt the 50-pound shells shake the earth, who heard the terrifying roar of quad machine guns, and saw their comrades broken by naval-grade fire, learned that lesson far too late. The American arsenal could turn anything into a weapon, even an unassuming truck.